when we're talking about culture in an inpatient service, we're talking about how does the environment feel. We're talking about how do the people that are employed to work there, the staff, interact with the patients that are using the service at the moment. Does it feel like a warm place, a safe place, and does it feel a professional place?
Well, culture is the way we do things around here. It's quite often the unwritten rules, the things that staff will tell you when you join that team that might not be written down in policies or procedures, but are expected behaviours and values of when you're working in that unit, and something that the vast majority of people will work to. Cultures can be really positive, and they can also be quite detrimental, not just for staff, but also for the people using the services.
My son Jamie was detained under the Mental Health Act when he was 18 years old and spent 19 months in 5 different psychiatric hospitals. One of the biggest things that we've come across when it comes to culture within inpatient services is the power imbalance that seems to exist between the professionals that work in the services and the patients and their families. So I would ask nurses, why don't you have a look at that power imbalance, see how it manifests itself in your service, and how can you make people feel that they're contributing to their own care and treatment? How can you make families feel welcome?
It might be that you're working in a culture that has a negativity to it, or could even be classed as toxic, and you may not even know it, because quite often when you're working in a situation, it's easy to think, well, that's how things are done around here. And if you've got limited experience of working in that sort of environment, or your previous experience has been equally as bad, then you may think, well, this is just natural, this is how things are done here. So
hi, hello. My name is Rosemary Rogers, and I'm the parent of a young man called Owen Rogers, who is now coming up to 22 in June. And at the time of his admission to hospital, he was 17. After about 2 weeks, it was really apparent that Owen's hygiene was really not, being prompted. So he hadn't been shaved. You could see that he hadn't brushed his teeth. His fingernails were really long, toenails were long, clothes were really unkept, unironed, some were ripped from maybe incidents or whatever. The whole appearance of his appearance completely changed overnight. He didn't really know how to cope because of his learning disability, so what he was doing was he turned his night into day. And he decided that he was going to sleep most of the day and stay up at night, because that way he wouldn't be involved in any incidents, or he didn't feel that he had to, be restrained. So that was his way of coping, that was his coping mechanism at the time.
I've worked in hospital medicine for over 40 years and therefore have some idea as to how hospitals should run. But whenever we raised our concerns with the decision makers on the unit, we found them to be incredibly defensive. If we pushed a little harder, we were usually met with the same response: why don't you make a complaint? But as we pointed out at the time, we didn't want to make a complaint. All we wanted was a willingness to listen to what we were saying, and a preparedness to act if they agreed with the points we were making.
The staff were just very closed. You couldn't really communicate with them. You couldn't ask them questions. You could see that they were very closed. They just didn't give you answers. They directed you to somebody else. And it just seemed like that they were expected to just be there, like really as bodyguards.
It's quite amazing, actually, the difference that a really good member of staff can make to a person's experience. I mean, Jamie was in one PICU where there was a senior nurse who was so kind. He would take the time to speak to me, talk to me about Jamie. He'd go out of his way to find out more about Jamie and what helped Jamie. You always had time to talk. And the little things, like if I turned up early, for visiting time, and he'd see me out in the car park and say, "No, don't wait out there, come on in." I mean, it was quite a trek to the PQ, so it was sometimes difficult to estimate your arrival time. It wasn't like popping around the corner. So if he saw me in the car park, he said, "Oh, you don't need to wait, just come in, it doesn't matter." He actually said Jamie shouldn't be here. He understood that. He shouldn't have been in that unit. And more than anything else, he made us feel like humans, like people. We weren't just a sort of, a unit or something to be counted or ticked off or not ticked off, or somebody who was in the way. He was just kind and understanding, and it made a massive difference.
We were lucky in that we did experience some examples of good care whilst our son was in a treatment unit. The occupational therapist really tried to make a difference, and alongside one of the nurses encouraged our son to get involved in gardening. And we have photos of him helping to build a willow arch. One nurse was a trained barber and would cut his hair, and other nurses would send us short emails and perhaps a photo following a successful trip out. We developed a strong bond with those nurses who demonstrated that they knew how we were feeling. Like the nurse who gave me a hug on the day we learned that funding for our son's care package had been agreed.
So 19 months in these psychiatric hospitals, going from one to the other, often in a cage in the back of a van or whatever. It just leaves huge trauma. So Jamie was restrained, constantly restrained, because the ward environment was so inappropriate and so traumatic for him. And at one point, he had his arm broken in a restraint. He wasn't taken to A&E for 24 hours. In fact, after the support worker broke his arm, he just pushed Jamie out into the garden and left him there. So as a result of all the trauma that Jamie suffered in these hospitals, he now has a diagnosis of PTSD. We have an independent report from a psychiatrist which says he's very, very unlikely ever to fully recover from that, his experiences. So we have the ridiculous situation where mental health hospitals are making people mentally ill. And that's just much more common than you might like to think. He still talks about his broken arm. He wants reassurance that the man who broke his arm isn't ever going to come near him ever again. And this is, 10 years later, 10 years down the line, we're still having these conversations.
So what are the early warning signs of a deteriorating culture? Well, there's been a lot of work around culture and what happens when things go wrong.
There was no feedback, there was no information about what was going on. It was just constantly talking about trying to move on to a mid-secure unit, and it just, they just didn't seem to want to, put in any form of therapies or anything that was going to help him to go back out into the community. It was all about trying to keep him in there. And there just really wasn't any communication, just more and more medication, and that's all we were told, really.
You might feel so uncomfortable, but actually a bit worried about trying to work against that culture. So if you have very strong values and you think, well, this isn't the way we should be working, this isn't what I came to do, to actually speak up and out against a culture can be difficult, particularly in that unit. So it can make you feel like you don't want to work there. It can make you feel anxious at work. It can also be quite enveloping. It can take over. You can become consumed by it because you don't want to stick out. Nobody wants to be unpopular or talked about.
In desperation, I wrote to the executive directors of the trust, explaining our dilemma and how we felt. This was a very measured letter, free from any vitriol, and I quoted from a letter attributed to Baroness Hollins, Emeritus Professor of Learning Disability, when writing to the then Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock, as there was a paragraph in that letter that struck a chord with us and encapsulated precisely how we felt. Specifically, too often the concerns raised by the families of those with learning disabilities and/or autism are considered to be hostile. The families are seen as the problem. This is unacceptable. They must be recognised as human rights defenders and, other than in exceptional circumstances, be fully involved in all relevant discussions and decisions. In their reply, the chief nurse and the medical director sent us a link to the Trust's zero tolerance policy on antisocial behaviour. It said that the culture in any organisation is set at the top, and in that moment the two most senior healthcare professionals in the Trust were demonstrating the very behaviour that Baroness Hollins was rallying against.
So for me, a positive culture is somewhere where I'd be happy to go in and work, happy to be cared for myself. Would I feel that my friends and family could come to this unit and participate in my care if I wanted them to?
So Jamie loves sweets. I mean, it's not just the taste of sweets, it's all the different colours. He's fascinated by different colours, so having sweets of different colours is really important to him. And we left a box of sweets for him in this PQ, which the nurses kept for him, just so he didn't eat them all at once. They started to realise that if Jamie became upset and had some kind of meltdown, that rather than restrain him and stick him in a hold for hours on end and just make the situation a million times worse, they would go and get the box of sweets and just sit with him for a while, help him, readjust, calm down, find his feet again, have a few sweets, have a little chat, make sure he felt better. And it worked. It worked. In fact, they used to call it PRN Haribo. It's about treating people like human beings. It's about recognising that that person sitting opposite you is a human being in the same way that you are, with exactly the same human rights that you have. They're in no way inferior because they're in hospital, because they're out of their own environment.
If you're a nurse and you're concerned about the culture in your environment or thinking that there's room for improvement, I suppose my first bit of advice is don't do it on your own. Culture can eat heroes for breakfast. If you're there on your own trying to work against a culture on yourself, you won't succeed. You ultimately need the team behind you. You need everyone's support. So I think it's find your allies would be the first thing to do. Talk to some of your trusted colleagues, see if they feel the same, see if they think that there are things that need changing, and start small and then work to bigger ones.
I think it is really important to talk to your leaders, and leaders who are doing their job well, and I'd like to include myself in this, leaders who are doing their job well will listen. If somebody comes to me and says, I'm worried about the culture in this unit, or I'm worried about, the behaviours of this group of staff or even this individual staff member, I'll always take that seriously, and I'll always ask and seek to find out more information. And in inpatient units, the best way to do that, and for me, our role as leaders, is to get some independent eyes and ears in there. You must raise your concerns, because if you don't and everybody else stays silent, we know that in extreme cases, people are harmed, not necessarily physically, but psychologically harmed. And that means that they really struggle to recover from what should have been a rehabilitative or a stabilising period of time in a unit, actually becomes the source of significant psychological and potentially physical distress, undermines the trust and values that people put in the NHS to care for their loved ones. So if you're worried, go to your leaders. If your leaders aren't listening, and of course that is possible, they could be so removed or they might not want to hear it. If they're not listening, you need to go to the most senior people in your organisation. You can also go to the Care Quality Commission. They have whistleblowing lines.
And I think, we have to remember, treat people as equals. Treat people as equals. Don't sort of, think that you can ride roughshod over their dreams, their needs, their fears. Be kind, be caring, try and understand. Putting that at the centre of how things are done, I think would make a huge difference.